some of you don't know me, and some of you are just still trying to get to know me. But even if you know me only a little bit, or this is your first experience with me, you might quickly pick up on the fact that I am an extrovert. Now, this doesn't just mean that I like to talk a lot or that I am comfortable speaking in public settings, although these things are true and helpful in my profession as a clergy person. But it also means that I draw sustaining energy from my interactions with other people. That's maybe more pronounced among people who are considered extroverts, but whether folks are an extrovert or an introvert or an ambivert or any kind of vert, we find that it is true that we as people need interaction with one another. We need each other. We long for each other. We find, for example, that little children, infants especially, absolutely need to be touched, to be held, to be spoken to or sung to. And that babies that are cared for in this way, that are interacted with a lot in their infancy, are healthier and more resilient. In fact, I have a friend who is herself a grandma, but her grandchildren live far away, some in Chicago and some on the other side of the world, literally. And before COVID, what this friend of mine would do is go into the hospital and take shifts holding babies that were born addicted to opioids because their birth parent had an addiction and used these substances, and the babies have addiction and are going through withdrawal in their own little tiny bodies. And they need to be held and tended and cared for. They need interaction with other people, more interaction than the nursing staff can give. They need that personal connection, and that will actually help them process through withdrawal and be stronger and more resilient. We all need one another as part of our wellness, our wholeness in body, mind, and spirit. I'm the Reverend Dr. Becca Gorell, pastor of the United Community Church in Morrisville, Vermont. And during the season of Lent, I am in connection with my colleagues, lay and clergy, to bring multiple voices, hearts, minds, perspectives, lived experiences to the healing stories in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus indeed calls us, reminds us that we are to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so he offers healing in heart, soul, mind, and strength. I'm not usually so pretentious as to use the big titles, but the doctor part is new this week, and it seems relevant because today I want to reflect with you about the need for strength, for wholeness, for healing of our minds, and how very important this is, how interconnected it is as part of our relationships with one another. Now, we are seeing in the midst of the pandemic and its isolation how profoundly we need each other. But I first learned that my extroversion existed in the context also of my privilege. In my very first church as a pastor, it was flu season, and we were discussing not doing the passing of the peace, or at least not shaking hands during the passing of the peace so that we didn't spread germs. We were so far ahead of our time. And after that conversation, a woman came up to me, a dear member of the congregation. She had no siblings. She had never married. She had no children. She had no living relatives of any kind. She was older and did not have work any longer. She was entirely alone. And church was her family, her community. And she said to me, "Pastor, please don't take away the handshake during passing of the peace. Some weeks, that is the first and only time all week that another human being touches me." And unfortunately, she was not the last person I would meet who would tell me this story, or a story like this. Certainly, adults living on their own, especially older adults, people who do not have employment outside the home, but also people who've been isolated or shunned by a medical condition because of their race or socioeconomic status, because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Children and youth living and growing up in homes that are not loving, that are neglectful. And now, during the isolation brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, I now know many people who can count the days, the weeks, sometimes even the months, between the time when one human being touches them. This causes harm to our bodies, to our spirits, and to our minds. Study after study is showing that during the pandemic, the cognitive function of adults in the United States is suffering, particularly older adults who rely on or relied on interactions with others outside the home, particularly in places like church, intergenerational gatherings, to stimulate the mind as well as the heart and soul, and as well as getting the body moving in and out of the house at least that one time a week. Without the connection with others, conversation, worship, song, and yes, touch, our minds have less to do, are less active, and are actually less healthy, less resilient, because we don't have connection with one another right now. It resonates for me so powerfully with the woman in this healing story that we have heard. There's two women, right, in this healing story. One very young, a girl even, but two female people healed by Jesus, and that alone makes this story fairly unique. Most of the other healings we've heard about have been men that come to Jesus. And certainly in this case, even for the young girl, it is a man still, a powerful man, a leader who comes to Jesus, interrupts Jesus, dares to interrupt Jesus to ask for healing, but healing for his daughter. And then as Jesus is on his way doing something very important, healing a girl who has died or appeared to have died, there is another person who interrupts him. And this woman fascinates me. Her story appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so, depending on the gospel, we learn some different things about this character, this woman. But this woman has a flow of blood, an issue of blood, some sort of disorder that is causing bleeding. And like the leper that we heard about the first week of Lent, that means that this woman is not only suffering from an ailment in her body, she is considered spiritually, ritually unclean. Her issue of blood not only renders her unclean, but much like the leper, renders anyone who touches her unclean. She can count the days, the weeks, the months, the years since someone has touched her. And certainly since someone has touched her without recoiling, without having to rush and purify themselves. But she is desperate for some sort of contact, some sort of connection with another human being. Her ailment has become a spiritual malady that the community uses against her, rendering her invisible, unworthy, dangerous to them and to their sense of purity, to their sense of community and connection to God and one another. And she must be so desperately longing for connection to violate all of these cultural norms, to appear in public, in a crowd where anyone could accidentally bump into her, and then to reach out to a man outside her home, to a holy man, a rabbi, to risk making him unclean. And so she thinks to herself, maybe I don't need to touch him, but I could just touch his garment, just the fringe, just the edge of his garment, and that would be enough. Maybe that would be enough. And Jesus, on his way to heal a girl, a child, a powerful man's daughter, pauses, is interrupted, turns and sees this woman, interrupting her isolation, and he calls her daughter. Daughter, your faith, your boldness in violating taboo has made you well. As with the leper, Jesus not only heals this person in body, but begins a process of restoring her to community so that she can be healed in that aspect of her spirit and her need for connection with others. And he does something even more profound and powerful. He begins to offer healing to her psyche, to her heart and mind and soul that has been through such incredible isolation. For days, for weeks, for months, for years. The scripture tells us that her body is made instantly well, but I imagine that healing of the trauma of isolation takes a lot longer than an instant. But it begins with her being seen by Jesus, being touched, reaching out to touch him, and having that not be rejected. She restarts her calendar, her mental clock of how long it's been since another human being looked at her, let alone touched her. But from the place of knowing that it need not be months and years this time. It's a healing I imagine is going to take us some time. We're not in the same situation as this woman who's reaching out to Jesus, reaching out for the healing and restoration to community, reaching out for the healing of knowing somehow, somewhere that she is worthy of touch, of love. And the way that her mind and her body have kept her separate from others, knowing that she is unclean, holding back so that she does not harm anyone else. We now will struggle, I think, recoil a little, even when we're allowed to touch again, to hug, to shake hands, to be in one another's presence without a mask. When you see it on TV or it happens by accident, doesn't that feel strange now? Our minds have filled in the pattern of isolation, and it's going to take us some time to heal that. But what we can do each moment is attune ourselves to those who are isolated, attune ourselves to those who've been pushed to the fringe and the margin, attune ourselves to those who are reaching out, not only to God, but to beloved community. How do we interrupt the isolation that hinders our health of body, mind, soul, and strength so that we can love God with all of who we are, including the wit and sharpness of our minds, including the strength and vitality of our bodies, including the openness and vulnerability of our hearts, even when each of these is not quite what it used to be. How do we begin to touch one another, even if that touch cannot yet be literal? How do we see one another, even if that sight is not literal? How do we open ourselves to those who are reaching out? Because each part of this story, these remarkable women, young and not so young, in need of healing, remind us that our God is one who will be interrupted, who will pause from one important thing for another, who places no human as more important than any other, and certainly none as any less important, but will stop, turn, take notice of those reaching out. Even the ones, especially the ones society says are not part of this beautiful tapestry, this beautiful mosaic. Christ calls us to be ready. Be ready for the hands reaching out even to the very fringes of ourselves, of our communities, to listen, to look, to have our hearts open to those who have struggled and suffered in isolation, ourselves and others, and to interrupt this isolation, to be in conversation, friendship, community, touch when that is safe and possible, love, service, worship, song, together. How is God calling us as faith communities to be the places where people can reach out and touch and be touched, can reach out and see and be seen, can interrupt and have their longing for connection met? May we take notice, and may we, when we reach out, find that it is Christ we touch, and who calls us to be in relationship, in connection to one another. Amen.